ーっていう3人の神様の使者がいて、この世界を見守っているんだって。
Still better heroes than, well, really, most of Phase 4. Continuing right from where we left off last week, the Sword Eyes of Light were introduced to, who is this guy again? Yeah, that dude who was pretending to be the big-nosed swordsmith. And kind of rightfully, they decided to ignore the discount tuxedo mask until he used that very mask as a boomerang and did pose a good question for Tsurugi as to whether or not he was confident they could defeat Gordy in a rematch. AKA the Bandai execs. So, as mentioned previously, this dude was an animated avatar of the real-life Shinosuke Tachibana, who was a spokesman for Battle Spirits. Thus, you could say this character was very meta in the sense that he was helping move the plot along in order to help sell their product. Granted, the gods he worked for weren't actually Bandai, of course, for the most part, and were actually characters in this world, but more on that later. He also mentioned they worked alongside a couple of other messengers named Galaxy Watanabe and Bomber. Hearing this, the Sword Eyes realized that there had been 3 legendary guardians who went by those very names. And in case you're wondering, yes, these 2 were indeed real-life ambassadors to the game, though unlike Tachibana, who was played both in the anime and IRL by the same guy, Watanabe and Bomber were actually played by different people. In particular, Galaxy Watanabe was played by one of the show's producers, Sho Watanabe, IRL, and voice acted by Daisuke Kishio, aka Fujipi for the anime. They would also add a 4th messenger for the next series, Ultimate Zero, who would go back to having the VA play both roles in Magical Star Saki, who, yeah, just guess who she was played by. Guess she got tired of swinging around that stupid leak. Anyway, all of that aside, they did end up bringing up some surprisingly deep talks about deities and why, in spite of having watched all of the events that led up to their current situation, Tachibana and his friends never lent a hand or prevented anything, and in fact even let Gordy get away with a sword brave. In other words,
Lord works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, legit, that's about as good an explanation as anything else for the show. He even offered to give him a proxy rematch with anyone of his choosing, as having connections with the quote-unquote gods gave him access to any cards he wanted. Tsurugi of course chose Yaiba, so he recreated his deck. Though, before the fight started, Tachibana also offered him the chance to win some new cards if he could answer his riddle correctly.
Halloween, it's gotta be candy. 3 Musketeers, lightest candy bar. F you.
Tsurugi answered with melon, which seemed to be the correct answer, which landed him 3 copies of a regular rare card. Yeah, God is a cheapskate. Okay, to be fair, not everyone's gonna be able to pull a super duper rare card out of nowhere, so this episode is actually doing a good job showing kids how to utilize a card that most of them would have pulled from a booster pack that had come out at the time. With that, the fight began and played out almost exactly like the previous one with Yaiba. I think it was implied that Tachibana was controlling the probabilities of what they would draw to recreate the fight, and thus act as a little tutorial for Tsurugi, where he could rethink some of his moves from back then.
Oh?
Yeah, realizing that sometimes better to maintain both a solid defense and offense, Tsurugi held back on his attacks, which meant Tachibana couldn't fully utilize Yaiba's Nine-Tailed Dark, even though he also went all in on the act. Well, I see someone got the pre-order bonus for Shang Tsung. But yeah, I really like this, as it was rather cleverly highlighting Tsurugi's character development through the main selling point of the show, the card game. Again, we specifically picked this series because we do think it's the best for newbies to this game who are interested in getting into it. Tsurugi did win some of his initial fights on his own with the all-out attack strategy, but also depending on the opponent, you have to adjust your strategies, which he was doing here in a smart way that also encouraged viewers to do the same. Great stuff. Anyway, the fight proceeded as normal, though Tachibana brought Yaiba's Sword Brave a turn early to make Tsurugi think a little more on his feet. Thus, it was a perfect time to try out his new card, Flamefield. Though after activating it, Tachibana posed a question to our shonen protagonist.
なぜそれほど白夜王に勝ちたい
Of course, he gave the typical hero line of wanting to defeat evil and all that, which was well and good, but then it was pointed out to him that Yaiba was far from the only Sword Eye of Darkness. Basically, he gave him a little reality check that trying to take on a whole empire with just his monotone droid might not be the wisest thing. Again, this show does a lot of things right for me, especially when it comes to shonen tropes. Anyway, Flamefield's effect was very much a hard counter for Yaiba's strategies, as until one of the player's spirits was destroyed, it could prevent all spirits on the field from being bounced or tapped. Thus, Tsurugi was able to implement his final move of the game with his usual shining combo, allowing him to clear Justice's field, sans his Ninetales. And while blocking with would have normally activated its effects, Flamefield negated both of them, allowing him to have enough attackers to end the fight. All the while, the Red Sword Eye declared his new more realistic goals and steps towards rescuing his mother and stopping the machinations of his brother. Thus, Tachibana was able to leave, satisfied knowing that he had helped move the show's plot along, though not before swiping a few souvenirs.
私のメロンパンが3個もなくなってる
Obviously, the implication was that melon bread was his actual favorite food, but he still gave Tsurugi those cards because, again, the gods told him to do so. With that, the episode ended with both the Eyes of Light and Darkness going their separate ways. In the case of the former, it was amicably, with Kizakura and Hagakure going to look for the remaining two Sword Eyes on their side, while Gordy just chose to go off on his own without the consent of his king. While previous episodes were pretty great in their own right, I do think the story of this particular episode was what grabbed my attention when I originally watched the series. While shonen, especially card game anime, tend to follow certain patterns, I do really appreciate when they have the protagonist just take a minute to consider the ramifications of their actions. They did both more overtly here with Tachibana just directly questioning Tsurugi, but also subtly and cleverly using the card game with him changing strategies after his previous loss to Yaiba. It highlighted how losses actually mean something in the show, giving it all a nice flowing narrative. Something that kind of shocked me when I looked up the writer to this episode was the fact that it was someone we're familiar with on this channel, Yuka Yamada. Previously, we had brought her up as one of the secondary writers of Star Twinkle Precure, who I'd argue wrote some of the weakest episodes of that season by putting a little too much focus on Lala. I mean, we all knew she was the main character of that show, but you didn't have to shove it down our throats. And yet, looking further into her biography, she tends to be a really good writer anytime when she's not working for Toei. I mean, she had wrote Slow Loop, Wataten, Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, and for this franchise, she wrote some of my favorite episodes across almost all the seasons. Yeah, in hindsight, maybe the real problem with her writing was always Toei, which shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Because honestly, she can write really good moral conflicts for heroes. Stories where just rushing in headfirst to fight the bad guys is actually pointed out as being a suboptimal tactic. Tachibana, unlike his other kind of sort of mentor character, took on a more hands-on approach to teach Tsurugi how to deal with Yaiba and the Eyes of Darkness. He didn't just directly give him the answers, instead had the Red Sword Eye figure it out for himself and learn from his past mistakes. It's good stuff that highlighted his growth, and even cleverly incorporated with the selling point of this show. It also helps that Mr. Justice was pretty much just a VA playing himself in an overly happy and entertaining manner. And overall, this was just a really good episode that featured great thematic storytelling and highlighted the ever-flowing narrative. Don't get me wrong, I like Prince Kanata just fine, but I do kind of wonder if this guy could have made Go Princess Precure even better. Next up, along with a third weekly show that we're going to have to start covering on the weekends, we're going to start working on a character spotlight for easily the scariest character in the Precure franchise. Yeah, it's the month of Halloween, so I think it's only appropriate we give flowers to the one character in this franchise who still scares all of us to this very day. Oh boy. Look forward to it, and until then though, farewell for now my friends, and if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go get some melon bread.
This is
Not for you.